Good day. Just before I begin this video, a quick reminder that if you are watching any of the videos from any of our three channels, that's to say the Duran, Alexander Mercouris or Alex Christoforou on Rumble, then if you go to the top of the video, you will see a red maroon button. If you press that red maroon button, that will take you straight to our locals homepage, where we have a thriving community which you can join and participate in. And in that case, you can also participate in my live streams, which happen every Wednesday. Well, again, this video for the time being has to be focused on the great crisis in Russian-Western relations, which is underway at the present time and which dominates every issue and has effectively made all the headlines. Now, as of today, the information on the front lines in Ukraine is pretty much, I think, as was the case yesterday. The Ukrainian force in eastern Ukraine is now fully encircled. We'll see how long it's able to hold out, whilst more importantly, perhaps, the Russian and Russian-backed militia from the Donbass appears to be making rapid progress, more rapid progress certainly than I had anticipated, in capturing the city of Mariupol on the coast of the Black Sea. This is Ukraine's last important port on the Sea of Azov, which is of course part of the Black Sea, and it is also Ukraine's major steel-making plant. I understand also that apart from that territory, which is directly controlled by the Ukrainian force, which is located inside the Donbass, the one that's now surrounded, pretty much all of the former territories of the Lugansk and Donetsk regions, which are claimed as being the territories of the Lugansk and Donetsk People's Republics, have now fallen under the control of those two republics. So once Mariupol is cleared, and once that Ukrainian force in Donbass lays down its arms or surrenders or is destroyed or is disintegrated in some form, then the two republics will in effect be in complete control of their regions. That's perhaps an important thing to say, because when the Russian operation began, one of its purposes was to achieve the control of these regions by those two republics. However, alongside the military operations, there is the diplomacy. And the event which took place today was the meeting between the Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov and the Ukrainian Foreign Minister Kuleba in Turkey. Now, the meeting lasted 90 minutes, which is relatively short. That suggests that there was no substantive negotiation. It seems that the Ukrainians came up with some kind of plan for Ukrainian neutrality, but Lavrov was unimpressed and rejected it. And I think that with the Russian military intensifying its control of eastern Ukraine and apparently steadily and incrementally tightening its control of Kiev, well, it's looking increasingly plausible that the Russians feel no particular incentive to compromise on any of the demands that they have made. And certainly Lavrov's comments after the meeting in a press conference he gave came across to me as being completely uncompromising. I think the Russians think that it's only now a question of time before the Ukrainians either come to terms on the demands that the Russians are making, or when the forces in eastern Ukraine, the Ukrainian forces in eastern Ukraine, in Mariupol and in Donbass are finally defeated, that the Russians will be in an even stronger position to dictate terms, which terms might be even tougher than the ones they've made up to now. Anyway, that seems to me to be a summary of the political military situation. But perhaps more interesting has been certain other developments. Firstly, we've had a comment from Josep Borrell, the European External, the European Commission, the European High Representative, I should say, for External Relations. He is the person who claims essentially to be, or it has the role, if you like, of being the quasi-foreign minister of the European Union. Note, by the way, that he is not in contact with the Russians. The Russians talk to the Germans and the French. Putin's had more conversations with Macron and Scholz. They don't talk to Borrell, a fact which I think he finds extremely frustrating. But anyway, Borrell has now spoken, and he's essentially confirmed that sanctions are, to all intents and purposes now, maxed out. He admitted that there are no further financial sanctions that the EU can realistically impose that are going to make any important difference to the Russian economy. And the impression I got from my reading of his words is that the EU isn't really looking to any further action, at least for the time being, to restrict oil and gas sales. The EU has come up with an extraordinary utopian plan to wean itself off Russian energy imports within a year. I don't think there is a single technical expert who remotely thinks that's possible. But anyway, perhaps more important is that Borrell has now essentially admitted that in sanctions terms, the EU is maxed out. And it was noticeable that after all the shock and awe of the last 2 weeks, the hope perhaps that the sanctions that were announced would lead to a catastrophic collapse of the Russian economy, a breakdown in its financial system, a collapse in its banks, bank runs, all those sort of things. Now that that hasn't happened, at least not for the moment, that Borrell is now once again saying that the most important of the sanctions is the restrictions on technology exports, which supposedly are going to lock the Russian economy into permanent obsolescence. This was, or so it seems to me, the original sanctions plan. The idea was that there wouldn't be action taken to disconnect Russian banks from SWIFT. There wouldn't be action taken to sanction the Russian central bank. If you go back a few weeks and look through all the various statements that EU and European and American officials were making at that time, you can go back and watch my earlier videos in which I discussed it. The emphasis was always going to be on restricting technology exports to Russia, in the belief that this would cause its economy, as I said, over time to become increasingly obsolescent. Somehow, at some point, someone decided otherwise, and we saw instead this lurch towards this decision to sanction the central bank, de-SWIFT some Russian banks, though far from all of them. Only around 30% of the Russian banking system is actually disconnected from SWIFT. All, I think, intended to trigger a bank run in Russia, but with that bank run so far having failed to occur, the Europeans and the Americans are quietly reverting to their original plan of locking the Russian economy into long-term obsolescence. I think the last throw was the attempt in the United States to stop Russian oil imports. I think all those rumors have caused so much chaos to world energy markets, have caused energy and oil prices to surge to such an extent that even the Europeans are now becoming increasingly alarmed about their implications. And I think that at some point over the next few days or weeks, we're going to start hearing quiet assurances given by European officials to European oil and traders that in fact there is no possibility of sanctions being placed on the Russian oil industry. Whether those oil traders believe that, whether they will, at least in the short term, start to deal in Russian oil in order to try to get the turbulence in world energy markets under control, well, that is another matter. But anyway, that was an interesting set of comments from Borrell, and we'll see whether or not it crystallizes into a sort of settled policy, or whether instead at some point there will be some new outbreak of hysteria, perhaps if Kiev does eventually fall, leading perhaps to another wave of sanctions which will have or cause even more problems on the European and Western economies. On the last point, I should say that I read one report, I want to stress it's only one report, but it suggested that the shock to the European economy, at least, from the sanctions, the backlash from the sanctions, could be as great as that from the recent pandemic. Now, if that's indeed the case, well, we're in for a very, very hard ride in Europe. And of course, it could be a much more difficult shock to overcome than the shock from the pandemic. But I'm not going to say that that's definitely the case, because I don't think anybody for the moment knows. Anyway, the interesting comments from Borrell. And they were matched, I thought, by equally interesting comments from the Russians. Now, there's been a lot of discussion recently about whether the Russians are going to default on their external debt. And the universal expectation is that they will, because at the moment, following the sanctions on their central bank, they are not really in a position to use their accumulated reserves to discharge their obligations. And that we won't fully know, by the way, until next month. But in the meantime, the Russian finance minister, Anton Siluanov, made an observation which I thought was absolutely spot on, at least legally speaking. He pointed out that the decision to freeze the Russian central bank's reserves, which has taken place in Europe, in effect amounts to a default by the Western countries that impose those sanctions upon Russia. And that's absolutely correct. If you put your money in a bank and that bank refuses to allow you to withdraw it, then the bank is defaulting on its obligations to you. If you hold money in a bank, then the bank, legally speaking, owes you that money and must repay it on demand. And I can't see logically why it should be any different in terms of the foreign currency reserves held by a central bank in depositories in the West. If the Western powers have seized those funds and won't release them to the central bank, which owes them, well, the Western countries are in effect in default on their legal obligations to that central bank. Well, I don't suppose many people in the West are going to pay much attention to what Siluanov said, but I think from a legal point of view, he's on strong ground. I don't know whether, by the way, he's planning to take any legal action in respect of this, but it does seem to me that the Russians are going to say straightforwardly that if they're not able to discharge any legal obligations to their creditors, it's because their creditors have failed to discharge their legal obligations towards them. So the Russians will no doubt deny that they are in any way in any kind of default situation. And I have to say, and then again, I'm speaking from a legal perspective, that if the Russians can't settle obligations because their central bank's reserves have been seized in this fashion, then I would have thought anyway that they have a reasonable legal case in terms of force majeure. Not that I expect anybody again in the West to pay any attention. But anyway, I report the fact because Siluanov's comments seem to me to be interesting. And then there is perhaps the other news of today, which has attracted virtually no attention in the West, which is that the Russians, or at least the Russian Foreign Ministry, has published a statement which strongly suggests to me Russia's intention to withdraw from the Council of Europe. Now, I'm not going to say whether or not this is indeed the decision. I'm going to read it because it is a little ambiguous, but this is what the Russian statement, the statement published by the Russian Foreign Ministry, says. The EU and NATO states which are unfriendly to Russia are using their absolute majority in the Council of Europe's Committee of Ministers to continue the destruction of the Council of Europe and the common humanitarian and legal space in Europe. The events are approaching a point of no return. Russia will not accept the subversive actions being taken by the collective West to replace international law, which the United States and its satellites, interesting choice of words, are trampling underfoot with a rules-based order. Russia will not participate in the campaign being waged by NATO and its obedient EU followers to turn the oldest European organization into another platform for preaching about Western superiority and for grandstanding. Let them enjoy each other's company without Russia. Now, that doesn't actually say that Russia is intending to withdraw permanently from the Council of Europe, but I have to say I can't really see how it suggests anything else. Now, that would mean, if Russia were to withdraw from the Council of Europe, that Russia would no longer be subject to decisions of the European Court of Human Rights. Now, that's something which I think the European Court of Human Rights would not be happy about. It's apparently relished its ability to interfere in Russian court cases. I will say this, for many years, the European Court of Human Rights acted, I thought, in a legally balanced way in dealing with Russian cases. There were plenty of cases in which the European Court of Human Rights found against Russia, but I always thought on valid grounds. And on overall, I thought that most of its decisions were fair and right and actually helped the Russians improve their legal system. But that has ceased to be true for the last 10 years. I think over the last 10 years, decisions have become increasingly influenced by, I'm going to say it straightforwardly, political biases. And there have been some very strange decisions made by the European Court of Human Rights in Russian cases, which, frankly, I found difficult to understand. So I am not surprised that the Russians have just decided to shrug their shoulders and walk away from an institution which, from their point of view, has simply become hostile. Given the enormous effort that the Europeans, the Western powers, made at one point to bring Russia into the Council of Europe, I would have thought that this would be a bitter blow. And it tells us much of the fever of the moment that virtually nobody is talking about it. Anyway, that seems to me to be a further case of the great parting of the ways. Russia is going in one direction, the West is going in another. There's not going to be, it seems to me, any meeting of minds anytime soon. Scholz and Macron continue to call Putin on a fairly regular basis. He speaks to them on the phone. Don't get the impression that much of any interest or utility is said over the course of these conversations. I think that one way or the other, the disengagement of these two blocs is going to accelerate. And on the topic of Russian oil and gas sales, I'm going to suggest that even if the Europeans were to decide that they're going to hold on to those indefinitely, they would find that the Russians themselves are no longer interested in exporting oil and gas to them, that the Russian oil and gas trade is going to start moving east towards China and Asia and away from Europe, and that whole trade, built up over so many decades, is now in its last days. So there we are, a situation in Ukraine where it seems to me the Russians are steadily strengthening their position, waiting for the Ukrainians to cave, gradually tightening their grip on the Ukrainian forces and perhaps preparing to take Mariupol. And at the same time, I ought to have perhaps added keeping humanitarian corridors in the big East Ukrainian cities still open in anticipation of the day when the Ukrainian army also withdraws from these cities, which I'm sure the Russians believe it eventually will do. But at the same time, an admission from Josep Borrell that the EU is now essentially sanctions maxed, that there's little further that it can realistically do, and action by the Russians to sever one of the most important links to the West, to Europe, which was set up after the end of the Cold War. I spoke in my last video about how Russia and the West is returning to the Cold War formula of peaceful coexistence. And it seems to me that with the events of today, we've taken another giant step in that direction. Thank you again for joining me. Remember what I said at the start of the program, you can join us on Rumble and on Locals and of course on other platforms. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. You can support us also by going to our shop and buying the great things that we have there. And last but not least, you can support us by subscribing to this channel and by pressing the like button for this video. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon.